discussion today, I think we should talk about why does Phronema matter. So this is, again, it can never be just theoretical. It has to be about a way of life. It has to be about our salvation. Why does our Phronema matter? Because it concerns our salvation. As St. Paul said, for those who have their minds according to the flesh, phronousine, think about the things of the flesh, and those who are according to the Spirit have their minds on the things of the Spirit. For the mindset, phronema, of the flesh is death, but the mindset, phronema, of the Spirit is life and peace. For the mindset of the flesh is hostile to God, for it does not submit itself to God's law, for it cannot. So here in that little passage, St. Paul explains why human reasoning does not work for arriving at theological truths, why ultimately we have to give up trying to logically comprehend and explain everything, because we are fallen, and because God is beyond all human reasoning and conception. Okay? So the other thing is, even if we're not, although we're fallen, even if we're not simply fallen, we tend to be carnally minded, which means if we're not spiritually minded, we cannot know God. What does it mean to be carnal, to be of the flesh? Now, people always think this has to do with something sexual, but it's not just about sexual sins. It's about being concerned primarily with the things of this life. And in that respect, we're all carnal. We don't have a spiritual orientation. We begin this new orientation when we are baptized. This is why it's called holy illumination. Our minds, our nous, is illuminated with the light of Christ, and actually the entire person is illuminated. In terms of our mentality, we begin to think differently. We should not think like the world. We shouldn't follow the standards, the models, the expectations, the values of this world, because we have put on Christ, right? All you who have been baptized into Christ have put on Christ. The old man has died in the waters of baptism, or the old woman, and we emerge as a new creation. We're expected to have the mind of Christ as part of this new creation. But do we? That's why it's important that we conform ourselves to Christ. We've received the Holy Spirit. So our attitude is important, our phronema, because when we think in a certain way, that affects our behavior. The converse is also true. When we engage in certain behaviors, it also affects the way we think. So we either come closer to Christ or we draw away from Christ based on, largely on our mentality, but also our actions. These things work together. We're never just a mind. We're not a mind walking through the world. We're a mind and a body. So what has happened in Western culture is that it has almost completely intellectualized the faith, and this has created a great distortion for Christians. To become a Christian has become almost synonymous with accepting certain sets of beliefs, okay? And so people argue about the beliefs and the teachings, etc. So the idea of having a Christian way of life, a Christian way of thought, has become very foreign to this culture. It used to be, I think something much more normal in American society, back when stores were closed on Sundays and most people went to church, and you had a kind of, there were certain sort of values that everybody accepted, but now the norm is to reject traditional values and instead to accept everything in alternative lifestyles and ideas. And so increasingly, we are foreigners in this Western culture because of the ideas, the norms, the values that are being promoted by the Western culture, and also because if you want to have some kind of a religious orientation, the culture discourages it because there's this idea that religion is something either private or something you just do on Sunday, but you have to keep it to yourself, basically. So what we have to be careful about is that because religion has become something kind of disfavored. I was talking to a fellow the other day, and he said that he works for a very big investment firm, and he says, this is the best firm I ever worked for, and they have excellent values. And they talk about honesty and integrity. It's this very Christian thing, but they're never allowed to talk about religion at the workplace. He says, I don't understand this, because he says it's the most Christian type of mentality that he's ever seen in any company, but they're not allowed to talk about anything having to do with religion. So here's where we are today. So we have many of the same presumptions and foundational beliefs in the church. So we have the mind of the apostles. On the other hand, in our day-to-day life, we're in the world, and very often the values of this world are something that's kind of running in the background. It's the background music to our life. And the attitude of the world becomes ingrained in us. And I think, unfortunately, this is increasingly happening, especially with the young people, who are absorbing this phronema, it's the phronema of the world, subconsciously. And this has become the default mode. And now it comes home with us. It used to be that the values and ideas of the world were outside the walls of your house, right? Inside the walls, it was what you talked about, the books you had there, things like this. Then television came. First radio came, then television came. But the television turned off at midnight or 1 a.m. or something like that. But now we have the internet, we have the telephone, the cell phones. And so we're walking around with the world in our pocket. And it's very difficult to not absorb subconsciously some of the values of the world. What we value, what we pursue, what we put effort into, what we admire, what we set as our goals are almost always worldly. Very rarely do we sit down and make a list of what we hope to accomplish this year in terms of our spiritual life, okay? So instead we're thinking about our position and our status and recognition and the job and money and fame and beauty and losing a few pounds and security and self-satisfaction, our reputation, and all kinds of things. So we have to check that. We have to actively think about our minds and our mentality, because we could be baptized and be attending church absolutely every Sunday. But if we think and act like the rest of the people in the world, if our orthodoxy is just kind of a covering or a dress, a clothing, rather than putting on Christ, we've put on the world. Underneath is Christ. That's not good. But I wish that were the case. Instead, what we have is Christ on top, and underneath it is the world. Okay? We're thinking and acting like the rest of the world. We're supposed to think differently, because our values and our priorities and our way of approaching the world should be different. We have to work to conform ourselves to Christ. Okay? So, how do we do that? It's very difficult, because we're really swimming against the tide, especially with the young people. It's a matter of serious concern, because and some of you during the break have told me that you could really relate to your own grandparents and how they had this deep piety, this deep faith within them that you could see. It was almost palpable, that you could relate to, even if they weren't Orthodox. Yes, many people had that. I don't think there are too many people that have that anymore. So what are we doing, those of us who are now the grandmas? Are we living that kind of life where this is something which you don't have to sit down and lecture somebody about Christ, but they can see it so they can remember. I remembered my grandmother and how she had this relationship with Jesus Christ, how she lived this life, how she had this deep faith. Think about all of these, when we remember our grandparents, the example that they set for us, how powerful that was. I don't think we're doing this for the young people. And instead, we bring them to Sunday school, 30 minutes a week, and we expect them to be Orthodox. Well, that doesn't happen. We have to make our home Orthodox, and we have to try to keep the culture out as much as is possible, because it is impacting our thoughts. Even though we don't realize it, we think that somehow we can sort of engage the world and it doesn't affect us, it doesn't taint us, but it does. So we have to say, I know that everybody says, well, why aren't you watching, let me see, Game of Thrones? I've never seen the Game of Thrones. Oh, it's a really good show. Well, I've heard that it's got a lot of violence and there's bad words in it. We don't do that in our house. Okay, so I'm not going to say that. I don't think I'm missing anything. Somebody told me that she belonged to a book club and they decided to read 50 Shades of Grey. Okay? And she says, I'm not going to do that. I can't do that. Oh, you think you're better than everybody? Oh, it's just a book. Look, we can't flirt with sin. Okay? So we have to make decisions, because even there are people who are Orthodox Christians and they watched all these things. I remember we had a parish in New York. One of our parishioners was a barber, and he cut the hair of one of the guys who was on The Sopranos. That was the hot show on HBO at that time. I've never seen The Sopranos either. Why? Because it was full of obscenities and things like this, a lot of murder and stuff. Boy, you can see that. You're still a Christian. You at a certain point, you have to say that this is affecting us. We cannot pretend that these things do not impact us, because whatever we see, this is why Jesus said, the eye is the lamp to the body. When that lamp is darkened, your whole self is darkened. What we use to see with, how we perceive things, this is what has to remain light. We have to be uninfluenced by the world as much as possible. How many secular songs do we know? Hundreds of them. Just pick one, well-known artist, like the Beatles. How many Beatles songs do we know? Dozens? A lot. How many hymns of the church do we know by heart? I doubt that we know as many. How many commercial jingles do we know? Movie catchphrases, lots of them. How many songs do we know by heart? Not very many. So you can see how these things have crept into our lives, and we don't even realize that we have absorbed the values of this world. And the values of this world are opposite that of Christ. And so we can tell, because when we're challenged with something, we see how quickly we take offense. Rather than saying, yes, I'm a sinner, I've made a mistake, we're quick to take offense, okay? Rather than recognizing, we want to perhaps lash back. So the world encourages us to think of ourselves first, doesn't it? That's the values of the world. To seek what pleases us, to pursue pleasure, to accept sin, to make excuses for sin. And if you say anything contrary to that, what do they say? Well, Jesus loved everybody, right? So we have to rationalize everything. That's what the world wants us to do, to say there is no sin. There's nothing wrong. That's human nature. Love is love. Don't you know that love is love? And Jesus said to love one another. That's all we're doing. So why does Orthodox Phronema matter? Because we are engaged in spiritual warfare, okay? You can't opt out like those poor men in Russia who are trying to flee the country to get away from being conscripted in the war. You can't opt out. You're in. And it's a fight to the death. There's only two sides. There's no neutrality. There's no middle ground. We're either with Christ or we're not with Christ. We want to believe that we're with Christ, but are we really with Christ? Are we really willing to abandon the values of this world? Are we willing to have the phronema of Christ? And even when it costs us friendships or jobs or things like this, not to be in a triumphalistic manner, well, I don't do that because I'm a Christian, but just simply to say, I'm sorry, but I can't participate. And if they push you, you say, I'm sorry, but I'm a Christian. We don't do that. Well, who do you think you are? You think you're better than we are? Well, no. But the point is that we know that when we stand for Christ, the world will oppose it, because the world is opposed to Christ. The world is opposed to God. So Christ always invites us to choose. I think this is the most wonderful thing. God does not impose himself upon us. God does not demand that we submit to him. This is the wonderful thing. When Jesus said, follow me, it's an invitation, all right? He invites us to choose. So we can be a follower of Christ or we can be a follower of the world. but most of us are kind of wishy-washy. And we know from Revelation, what's it going to do with the lukewarm people? That's right. Because we want to follow Christ, but we don't want to give up our life. We want to hang on to those vestiges of sins. That was St. Augustine, if you ever read Confessions. That's what he talks about. He talked about being in a sort of state of sleep, where, just a little longer. It's that twilight which you don't want to quite wake up. He didn't really want to give up his sin. So he said, give me chastity, but not just yet. That's his famous line of St. Augustine. So, I think a lot of us can relate to that. We say we want to follow Christ, but we really don't want to give up our lives. We really don't want to be challenged. We don't really want to sacrifice. We want the easy way out. But the baptismal epistle tells us that we were buried with Christ with a baptism like his, so that when, as Christ rose, by the glory of God the Father, we too might rise in newness of life. We've put off the old man, we're supposed to put on the new, and we've been in, as St. Paul likes to tell us also, we're in the army. That's why he uses that military language about the breastplate and the helmet and the sword and the sandals and all of this. So Phronema matters because this is spiritual warfare. And without the right mindset, you cannot be saved. Why not? Because salvation is not ascribing to a set of beliefs. Salvation is not performing a checklist so that you can get into heaven. I mean, if you want that, you have to go someplace else. That's why Orthodoxy is so maddening. It really is. What do I have to do? Father, just tell me, what do I have to do? Well, do this. This is the start. This is where you begin. And you know what? When you fall down, just get up and keep on going. That's what Orthodoxy is. It's the recognition that you never arrive. You're always trying to improve, but that shouldn't discourage us. So the Catholics, they can tell you, what do you have to do to be saved? Very simple. You die in a state of grace. And they are thinking about, am I in a state of grace? Father, I did this and such, but I didn't go to confession yet. Am I in a state of grace? So they have a certain certainty that's very appealing to them. You just have to die in a state of grace, and you'll go to purgatory, so you're going to suffer for a little bit, but eventually you'll get to heaven. So the Protestants, well, we know exactly what you have to do to be saved. Do this, 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 this. You're saved. You don't have to worry about it ever again. And we just don't offer those kinds of certainties and guarantees. It's a little uncomfortable as an Orthodox Christian, but we have to accept that, okay? So salvation for us is not achieved by checking specific boxes. We can't just go through the motions. And this is where I think we're failing and where we have to really challenge ourselves. We can be doing all the right things, going to church, saying our prayers, fasting, the prostrations, the almsgiving, whatever it is. But we can do all of that, and interiorly we're unchanged. We're unmoved by all of this. And this is dangerous. This is us being those people on the left that say to the Lord, 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 didn't we called you Lord, we took care of all these people, we did this. Many will say to me, Lord, Lord, and I'll say, get away from me, you evildoers. Didn't we cast out demons in your name? We went to church every Sunday, we pledged, we did prostrations, get away from me. Why? Well, that could happen to us too. Because all of the things that we do in the church are designed to heal the soul. And if we're doing them as a matter of a sense of obligation, okay, then we're not changed by it. It's supposed to, prostration, for example, are supposed to evoke in us a sense of contrition. If we're just doing it mechanically, then we're not benefiting from it at all. So we have to remember that Orthodoxy is not about rules, not about performing certain actions that somehow guarantee some kind of result. So what is salvation? How is it achieved? It's eternal life with God. So we know this. So I'm not saying not to do these things. I'm not saying that these things don't matter. These things are tools that the church gives us precisely for changing us so that we conform ourselves to the image of Christ. Because salvation is union with God. To be united with God, we have to become like God. So we can do a lot of things and still remain very far from God. So that's where the challenge is, I think, for us. Especially for those of us who have spent years in the church, we have a tendency to, it becomes kind of routine. We're very comfortable. And sometimes it's good not to be so comfortable. Sometimes it's good to, especially to continue to reflect on our own unworthiness and our own sinfulness. So, how do we acquire an Orthodox mind? How do we develop an Orthodox phronema? What to do and what to avoid? So first of all, we have to make consistent efforts over a long period of time. So there's a famous verse in the Gospels. The kingdom of heaven is taken by violence, Jesus said, and the violent are taking it by storm. You know, I've read quite a few commentaries. No Western commentator has any idea what that means. They really don't. Because they are divorced from the tradition of the church. The Orthodox know what it means. It has a long history. The kingdom of violence kingdom of heaven is taken by violence. How can kingdom of heaven be taken by violence? But what that means is that you have to work hard. You have to exert a lot of effort to enter the kingdom of heaven. That's what he's saying. Not that you kill people or something. It means that we work with God. We can't be passive. You have to really work at it. Now, we're not saying we save ourselves. We don't save ourselves. But we have to work at it. We have a role to play in our salvation. As you know, what St. Paul said was in our reading for today. Work out your salvation with fear and trembling. So why do we have to work at it? Because holiness is difficult, right? Living a life of self-denial, denial of the self-will, living a life of love, living for others, a sacrificial life, that is difficult because the first sin is the sin that most of us succumb to. We always think about ourselves. What about me? You know, how is this going to impact me? So it's always this pursuit of the self-will, the self-desires, and this is the hardest thing to eradicate. So the things that the church gives us are tools and medicines that help to heal us, okay? So even though we feel like, how can this help? Little efforts matter. So we should never say, well, I guess it doesn't really matter. Okay, well, I forgot this, I didn't do that, I could have done, but do it. Do what you can. It's like water dripping, right? Constant effort, even things that seem kind of unimportant, they direct our lives, they direct our thoughts and our behavior toward God, and this gradually transforms us if we do it in a prayerful manner. So this is what we want to do. You have to recognize you'll never be perfect. You're never going to arrive. You're never going to reach the goal. You never wake up one day and say, I have an Orthodox phronema, okay? But someday you may. But you'll have it. It'll never be a perfect phronema. Growth is important, and there's a kind of progression. We're going to have setbacks. We're going to have failures, but we don't give up. We have to engage in the spiritual warfare. And this is going to happen whenever we try to change our lives. The evil one will try to find ways to thwart our efforts, to turn us away from our goal. Complications will arise. People in our lives will disapprove. The car will break down. Things will happen because the evil one tries to get us to not change our lives. Right? So we have to recognize that the stakes are high. This is why we exist on this earth. Our purpose on earth is to gain the kingdom of heaven. So we have to remember that that's our goal, and ultimately everything else will fade away. So even though we try to build something for our family, for our grandchildren, for a business or something, we have to recognize that all of these things are just dust in the wind. But what matters is our soul and eternity. So we just have to, and when we do this, and when we realize that we've lost our focus, we repent, we ask God to redirect us, and we start again. So we have to know why we exist on this planet. And I think that this is why the monastics say that the most important thing is remembrance of death. It's not a morbid thing. It's that we remember that we're only here for a short time, and we have to put our efforts where it really matters, because nobody can help us but us. Nobody's going to save us but us. So the next thing we have to do as Orthodox Christians to acquire Phronema is seek illumination by the Holy Spirit. Through spiritual purification, through virtues, we try to acquire the mind of Christ. When we were chrismated, we received everything. Countless gifts of the Holy Spirit, manifold gifts of the Spirit. But then we have to apply it. We have to come to a knowledge of God through the application of these gifts, through the purification of the mind. And we have to do it through prayer, because we don't come to knowledge of God through human reasoning. We can learn about God by reading, but we don't come to know God except through prayer. So, again, I'm not discouraging you from learning about your faith, studying theology in the Bible, or anything like that. Of course, I think it's great. We should do this. But don't think that because you know a lot about the Bible, you've got God all figured out. That you're any closer to God. Because knowledge is intellectual. It's not a spiritual thing. So to have an Orthodox mind is to have a mind that's receptive to the Holy Spirit, that has a life directed by the Spirit, not our human reasoning. So, how do we acquire an Orthodox Phronema? I'm going to give you some ideas of things to do. They're kind of obvious, but maybe there are something to think about, and things to avoid. First of all, participate in the life of the church. It seems so simple, but I just want you to think about it, especially for those of you who are converts or catechumen. The more often you can come to church, the better. So try to attend Saturday night Vespers, try to attend, of course, Sunday mornings, but other services too, weekday services. The more you can immerse yourself in the life of the church, the better. You are learning a whole different way of life. And you don't know what you don't know. You're just sort of trying to figure things out. Well, this happened when you were born on this planet. You were born not knowing anything. We kind of forget how much we learn in the process of our human growth. You were born not knowing anything. You know, babies, when they're born, they don't even know that their hands are their own hands. Okay? So the baby is crying and they're going, wah, wah, newborn, and they see this thing going in front of their eyes. They have no idea it's their hand. Did you know that? And then they discover that's their hand. And that's when they begin to put it in their mouth and they're manipulating their hand. That's part of human development. So if you were born not even knowing that your hand is your hand, then what else have you learned? You learned a lot of things, but you learned them gradually. And you know what you did most of the time? You just watched everyone as a little kid, as an infant. You watched. And then you tried things, and then you fell down and you tried some more. But we slowly learn what it is to live in society. We slowly form relationships, and then we form other friendships maybe with our cousins and brothers and sisters, then with neighborhood kids. Then we go to school, and that's a whole different world with other kids. And you learn kind of like the rules of the playground and what's expected of you in school. You get older and you start dating and you learn other sets of rules and how to behave, and you mature. Well, that's what happens in the spiritual life. You start out knowing nothing, and you read and you watch and you think and you grow, and along the line, slowly, you learn what it is to think Orthodox, and everything shapes us. So the more that we can do to continue that trajectory and stay away from the destructive elements, the bad stuff on the TV, the bad internet sites, it's like taking that child that was making real progress and putting them in a cave. How is that going to help their development? It's not going to help. So we have to try to avoid these things. And we have to recognize that these are enticements, they are lures of the world to distract us from the spiritual life. But the spiritual life is so much more fulfilling, so much more beautiful. so much deeper. So we need to come to church, participate in the life of the church, pray the prayers, listen to the hymns, join the choir if you can sing. Stand there and just follow along even if you can't sing. But you've got to participate in the church. Say your prayers every day. Have a ritual, a routine. Cross yourself frequently. Sanctify your moments during the day. Pray before meals. Pray before undertaking certain tasks. Bless your computer. Seriously, do these. You don't have to be a priest to bless something. You do this. You put your fingers like this, and you can bless anything. That's the sign of the cross. It doesn't require priestly ordination to bless something. We bless ourselves like this, right? Why can't we bless your coffee cup in the morning, bless your computer, bless your car? I mean, this is how we incorporate Christ in our life. We become more mindful of Christ in our life. Participate in the sacraments. Now, everybody knows about communion. What about confession? You got to go to confession. If you haven't or you don't do that regularly, there is no single practice that is more useful than confession. You have to expose the wound. Remember, the church is the hospital for souls. That's what St. John Chrysostom, all the fathers would say this. The church is the hospital for souls. If you go to confession and you don't tell the priest the whole truth, not only is it invalid, but you get nothing out of it. Even though you feel like you might be embarrassed, don't worry, the priests have heard everything. They're not judging you, they really aren't, okay? Expose the wound. Say the thing that's hard for you to say. Just say it, expose the wound. It's like you go to the doctor, you have a great big gash on your arm, and how are you doing today? I'm just fine, okay? Next time, how are you doing today? I'm just fine. Meanwhile, gangrene is growing. No, seriously. Expose the wound. You know how quickly the devil, it's amazing. It's amazing. Confess what it is that is tempting you, and very often it will stop because it doesn't work anymore. You've exposed the wound. Get your healing. Go to the communion is extremely useful, extremely important. Not, again, as a routine, we have to confess our sins, the legalistic thing. But there is such power in that, in the advice that you get, in the direction that you get, in the change of you take your power back from the devil who is tempting you. Read the scriptures and other spiritual works, even a little bit every day if you don't have a lot of time. There's daily Bible readings. There are podcasts. The Path on Ancient Faith Radio that has the daily Bible readings and readings from the fathers, and then there is like the Greek Archdiocese of America has a site that's called Daily Readings, but I'm sure a lot of the other churches have a site, Daily Readings, and you could be standing in a line, waiting for your coffee from Starbucks or whatever you do, and you could read the epistle and gospel of the day and see the life of the saint, and this just connects you. These are little things, but all of these things add up. Cultivate virtue and do good works. These things shape us. Make your home into a little church. Have an icon wall. You probably do already. Try to keep the candela lit. Keep the candle lit. I know a lot of people have the oil. I don't like it because it's messy. Father goes to Martha. I said, I can't do it because I can't deal with the little oily on the fingers and everything. Oh, we have candles. Okay, I get the little votive candles, I get the big tall votive candles for the store. You can find those anywhere. So keep the votive lamp lit, say your prayers, put out the icons of the feast if you have them. It's something nice to have. If you don't, you can order sets of icons for the major feasts and put them out as the season changes and you remember this. You don't have to be a priest family, to live like that. So, what else? Practice fasting. Why do we fast? We don't get points for fasting. We don't, remember what St. Paul said, food will not commend us to God. So why do we fast? Remember that we're supposed to be teaching ourselves self-denial, the denial of the will. So if you fast and you become difficult to live with, so that your husband or wife says, please stop fasting, you're not doing a very good job. We're not supposed to fast to become irritable. Okay? And if we're fasting from food, we should be fasting from other things too, like the television and other things. So we have to remember what all of these things are for, and that there has to be a purpose behind it. It's not just a task to be performed. Learn about your Orthodox faith. That's the next thing we can do. But accept that we cannot understand or explain everything. There's a line from the communion prayers, and it is, "Deliver me from the slavery of my reasoning." So there is something within us that wants to explain everything. And just, well, how can this be, and how is this, and how is it? And you know what? We're not the first people. I don't think because we're scientific. St. Cyril of Alexandria was talking about this. Her system talks about this problem with the question, how? Well, how can this happen? How can this happen? We have to be careful about that. So, what to avoid? We have a few minutes left. I'm going to give you 10 pitfalls, 10 things to avoid if we're trying to create an Orthodox Phronema. First of all, extremism, legalism, and rigidity. Okay, so we have a tendency to do this. Do you want to be Orthodox? I'm going to be Orthodox, and by God, I'm going to be the best Orthodox Christian. I've decided, so there's this tendency among many people out of piety, I'm not saying that they're not well-intentioned, and desire to really be a good Orthodox Christian. They take this Western idea that they had, which is about rules, about legalism, about, rules and explanations and definitions. So they say, this is how you're supposed to fast. They read the canons of the church, and then they think that they know everything. Well, the priest doesn't know what he's talking about. This is what we're supposed to do. So unfortunately, many converts are vulnerable to this idea, this need to control, this need to have certainty. I want to be certain that I'm fasting correctly. What should I do? So they try to do, this real fast of the church is bread and water for Lent. Did you know that? That's in the canons. I should have told you that. Don't follow that. Okay? That's not for most people. Okay? So you ask your priest, Father, what should I do? Okay? Do what he says. The virtue is in the obedience. Okay? Not that you're supposed to fast in a particular way. And for people, sometimes there are different rules because of their particular situation in life, their health and whatnot. I'm laughing because I was pregnant with Chris. We had a pregnancy before Chris, and that baby died. It was a very, very dangerous pregnancy. So when Chris came along, and he was kind of a miraculous thing because I had been praying for a baby for a long time, but Chris came along and I was expecting Chris. We got this brand new priest who was going to be the assistant in our parish, and they were looking for a place to stay, and it was Lent, and they were looking for a house to rent, so they were living with us for a couple of weeks. So I didn't want to scandalize this young priest, but because of my really dangerous pregnancy that I had before, I wasn't fasting during Lent. I was eating meat, but I didn't want to, serve meat or anything. So after they went to bed, I went outside and I turned on the barbecue and I got some lamb. So the next morning, the priest, Father Foti, came downstairs and said, I don't know about this Lenten fast, but I could swear. I smelled lamb last night. Oh my God, I can't wait for the fast to be over. I swear. I came clean. I said, Father Foti, I'm sorry, that was me. You did smell lamb. That was me. So that was, but we don't know what a person's situation is. I broke my pelvis in 2 places a few years ago. That was very bad. And I look, you can't tell because they can't do anything for you. You just have to sit and suffer with it. They can't put you in a cast or anything like that. So after a couple of weeks or 3 weeks, I was able to go out to the grocery store. I could not walk more than a few feet. So I got in the grocery store and I got in one of those little carts that the people drive, and I looked perfectly healthy. People probably said, oh, she's just some lazy, driving around in her little cart. But honestly, I could not walk through a grocery store. So I thought about how many times I had judged people, who looked perfectly fine. We don't know what's going on with others. So we have to be so careful. So number one, avoid extremism, legalism, rigidity. Why? It leads to spiritual delusion, pride, self-righteousness, and judging others. Okay? We don't want to replace a list of Protestant rules with a list of Orthodox rules. Okay? We don't really have rules. There are no rules of fasting. They're fasting guidelines. But they can differ, and you don't know what's going on with somebody. That's why we're not supposed to judge. And there's something else. St. Simeon, the New Theologian, oh my gosh, I'll never forget this. He said, never judge anyone, even if you see them sin. Never judge them, because you don't know how hard they fought against the sin before they fell, and you don't know how deeply they have repented. That's very powerful. So that's why we leave all of these things to God. So we have to be very careful, especially for those of us who are enthusiastic, new Orthodox, that we want to tell other people that this is what you're supposed to be. And I'm telling you this because I did it, okay? Because I was born into the church, but I came to Orthodox, and once I realized what it was, I was very enthusiastic. And I was doing a lot of these things, so I'm guilty of it also. But in terms of the legalism and the scrupulosity, being more scrupulous, being more strict, does not make you more Orthodox. Jesus was not known for scrupulously following the law of Moses. That makes us into Pharisees. So if you come to church, and somebody comes to church and brought something during Lent for the coffee hour, and there's dairy in it, don't, start World War III. Because I heard about parishes where somebody brought milk instead of the coffee, the dusty coffee creamer. It became a big deal. That's the devil. That's the devil using our good intentions, our good things, trying to keep the fast against us. So we have to be very, very much careful about that, because when we begin to do these things and it develops into pride, look at me, I'm doing this, we also develop a self-righteousness and condemnation toward others, okay? So then we've lost everything, all right? So the Lord condemned the Pharisees for being, looking at little details and missing the big picture, straightening out the gnat and swallowing the camel, okay? So we have to be very careful. Orthodoxy is not about rigidity. Orthodoxy is not conservative. Orthodoxy is not severity. Okay? We have to avoid extremes. Complacency is on one side and legalism is on the other side. Somehow in between we have balance. Orthodoxy is about balance. That's from St. Gregory the Theologian. Remember, Orthodoxy is balance. We're not extremists, but we're not complacent. Number 2, avoid false piety and false humility. Don't make a show. Don't make a pretense. Don't pretend to be something. Don't think you have to be a certain way. Now that I'm Orthodox, I guess I have to grow a beard, if you're a man. Now that I'm Orthodox, I guess I have to wear Birkenstocks. I mean, there are some parishes like that. I don't think this doesn't strike me as one of them. But we do have some parishes that are there's a kind of cultic sort of vibe. There's an ortho-hippie kind of Mother Earth. You gotta homeschool your kids, otherwise you're not a good parent. I mean, I don't, listen, we have to be careful that we don't make Orthodoxy into that. If that's what you want to do, and that's what you feel, you really want to dress like this, and you want to, I'm obviously great if you can homeschool your kids. I'd kiss your feet. I could never do that, honestly. But that's not the measure of our orthodoxy. This is what I'm trying to say. We shouldn't measure and judge others according to these kinds of outward things, the hair coverings, the beards, and things like this. Don't try to be something. Be, an Orthodox Christian. Live your life in the place that you are, and try to live your life with humility. You don't have to try to behave in a certain way. Don't worry about that. That's a false pretense. And so that's something you should avoid. Because I've heard people say, well, you should always look down at the ground. You should always look at the ground. No, seriously, I'm not kidding. Why? Because that shows humility. The downcast eyes is a sign of humility. Well, Jesus was pretty humble, I hear. And I think he looked people in the eye. All right? So these kinds of things, they're fake. And yet they give us pride. So what are we getting out of it? So let's be careful, people. Be careful. Number 3, follow an appropriate lifestyle for the stage of your life and your place in the world. If you're not a monk or a nun, don't try to be a monk or a nun. Don't neglect your family. Okay, so what happens very often is people try to adopt a kind of monastic way of life, and they live in the world. And it doesn't work if you're in the world. You are Orthodox in the world. If you want to have a monastic life, you have to go to the monastery. Okay? Because what happens is, it's just as strange as it would be to have a monk living like a worldly person. A person in the world is not supposed to live like a monk or a nun. Now, I'm not saying to be like the world, but sometimes, the reason why I'm telling you these things is because of what I've seen. My husband has been a priest 43 years. I've seen a lot in the parishes. I've seen marriages in trouble because one person becomes Orthodox, like super Orthodox, and wants to live like a nun in her house, and she's married. And this created stress in the family, within the couple. So it's so easy to say, but what's wrong with that? I just want to sleep on the floor. And he's saying, but I want you in the bed with me. But the monastic ideal, the self-denial, is to sleep on the floor. I want to fast like this, but I can't do that. And then they have an argument. So the devil, watch out, he's very sneaky. He takes the good things and he uses them against us. This is why you need to go to confession. Because sometimes you don't understand why this good thing that you want to do can actually be harmful. Because right now, for all of you who are here in this retreat, he's not going to tempt you with obvious things. The devil's going to try to destroy you by bringing you ideas about good things. Rather than going to church on Sunday, we should be down taking care of the homeless. Yes, that's a good thing. So you tell Father, and Father says, no, you need to be here for church. That priest, he doesn't love the poor. I'm going to tell everybody in the church, Father doesn't love the poor. Because all I want to do, Father, is help the homeless. But why on Sunday morning? Well, that's the day that they're distributing the food. Well, why can't you set up something else to distribute the food another day? We actually had this happen in our parish. Okay? I'm not kidding. So you look at how the devil works. And when you have an idea and you're so convinced that you're doing something noble and wonderful and righteous, and somehow you're wreaking havoc in your life, stop and think about the fact that this could be a deceit of the devil. It's spiritual delusion. Okay, it's very easy to fall into this, but that's why we go to the priest. That's why we go to confession. So the priest can give you a smack and say, hey, wake up. The Greek priests do that. The Greek priests like smack. Not really, but they actually, that's a Greek thing to smack you on the side of the head, but the priests don't hit you. Avoid self-righteousness and hypocrisy. Oh my goodness. I think that speaks for itself. Don't act out of a sense of obligation, but try to conform to the church. Yes, let's conform our lives to the church, but try not to do it because you feel like you have to. Orthodoxy is about freedom. The Holy Spirit is about freedom. That means we're not slaves. That means we don't have to. That means it's not a rule. But at the same time, these things are given to us by the church because it's good for us, because we learn from it. So obedience is important, but not slavery. Don't do things out of a sense of obligation. I want to tell you about one thing that St. John Chrysostom talked about. I thought this was so powerful because I'm guilty of this too. I have to, I guess I gotta go. I have to. When you have that feeling like that you have to do something or you should do something, let's try to change our attitude about that. Again, this is the Phronema. So I'm telling you about St. John Chrysostom and Cain and Abel. So the Cain and Abel story, you all know it. Cain killed Abel because he was jealous of Abel, because God accepted Abel's sacrifice and he did not accept Cain's sacrifice. And the question has often been among Bible scholars, why did God not accept Cain's sacrifice? And some people said it's because Cain offered vegetables and Abel offered meat, animals, and that's not it. And Chrysostom says that Cain did this, offered the sacrifice out of a sense of obligation. That's all. So he offered the sacrifice. It's like us. Well, it's Sunday morning. Oh, I guess I got to go to church. A sense of obligation. He was indifferent to God. And the word is rathimia. Rathimia. Indifference towards God. And actually, that's what Chrysostom says the sin of Adam and Eve was. Indifference. Not rebellion, but indifference. And boy, a lot of us are guilty of being indifferent toward God. So it's because, did Cain fulfill his obligation? Yeah, he brought a sacrifice to God. God did not accept it. Why? Because he didn't do it out of love. He didn't do it with the right spirit, with the right phronema. He was indifferent to God. He did it out of a sense of obligation. So this is very important. In Orthodoxy, we have a tendency to sort of think that there are certain obligations which we must fulfill, but I'm trying to encourage you not to do things out of obligation, but that doesn't mean not to do them at all. Try to understand the reasons for these things and try to put your heart in these things and follow these customs even when we don't understand them. Try to seek understanding. Ask God to explain them to you. Seek them and do them and ask for the right spirit to understand them. But don't do them simply out of obligation. So, don't be judgmental. That's another one. That's number 6. Don't compare yourselves to others positively or negatively. This also happens. Very often people study, they read a little bit, they think they know better than everybody else. And you know, without humility, we cannot be saved. We cannot be saved. So this is a big temptation. Don't think of your spiritual life as a checklist to be accomplished. We've talked about a lot of these things already. Our goal is union with God, which comes through a lot of different ways, but not by checking things off, but by really engaging in the life of the church. Number 8, don't give spiritual life advice to others. Don't give spiritual advice to others. I think it's very dangerous. This is one of the things we're seeing a lot on the internet these days. You can share your faith, that's a good thing, but be very reluctant even to share your own experiences with others, because sometimes people assume there's a kind of one-size-fits-all. I made this mistake once. Somebody asked me a question at a retreat, and I said, well, my spiritual father has told me to do this. And they were writing it down. They're like, no, wait a minute. That's what he said for me. That doesn't mean it's applicable for you. Okay, so don't give advice to others. And obviously we want to share our faith, but don't share what your spiritual father told you what to do. Never say what you said in confession. This has happened where the priests do not reveal confessions. They take that very seriously. But other people go out and tell people what they said in confession. And then others find out and they say, oh, Father so-and-so revealed the confession. No, you're supposed to keep your mouth shut too. The priest keeps his mouth shut. You keep your mouth shut too. That's between you and God and the priest. You should consider what's inhibiting your spiritual growth, what keeps us from acquiring an Orthodox Phronema. Sometimes it's because we've just become too busy. And we find we're very distracted, we're very overwhelmed by all of the chores, all of the things we need to do in our life. And I'm guilty of this too. So we have to find a way to pull back and change our life so that we make time for God, for our families and other things. It's so easy to get so busy that we run out of time and we say, I don't have time for church, I'm too tired for this. So we have to make God a priority. And the last thing I would advise is for you to be patient. You're a child in the faith. We all are. We're still learning. It's going to take a long time for us to mature. Be quiet, be observant, be humble. Don't try to be anxious to grow up. Remember, when you were 9, you wanted to be 10. When you were 10, you wanted to be 13. When you're 13, you want to be 16. When you're 16, you want to be 18. When you're 18, you want to be 21. Remember that? Well, you are who you are at this stage. Don't compare yourself to others. Be humble, be observant, take things slowly, don't be in a rush, and just keep on working at your spiritual life gradually, but do it with real intention. very deliberately with purpose, not because you think that things are an obligation. And by all means, avoid the internet and some judgment of others. And you can find, I do think we should learn about our faith, but we can find better outlets, better places to learn about. We've got books downstairs, all kinds of books. I would start there and try to avoid things that are negative. At any rate, I'm going to stop at this point because we have a little bit of time left for questions or comments. I wish we had more. So anybody want to start? Yes, Father.
I just wanted to jump on your point about blindness. Very neat. He came to a very big conclusion at the end of his life.
Okay.
And he had said, after writing this Phronema, which was his master.
Can you hear this?
Okay.
Stand up and speak real loud.
Okay. Three categories. Thomas Aquinas wrote the Summa Theologica, which was a theological magnum opus. And in the Summa Theologica, it laid out a philosophical view of Western theology. However, Thomas Aquinas was taken out, number one, by his ways. Number two, he came to a final realization. He said, I cannot write more beyond this point. So even a lot of these Western theologians, these Roman Catholic and Protestant writers, they come to the realization that certain things are left to mystery. Augustine was another one too that gave himself over to fraternal correction, which is why we have him as a saint in our church. So a lot of these Western writers, they do come to that conclusion of mystery, but without calling it mystery. And this is what's been bridging the gap, primarily in the theological dialogue of our church with the Roman Catholic and Lutheran churches. Anyway,
Thank you, Father.